Northeast states. We really can't get to where we all want to be when we want to get there if we're really acting as 9 different islands. So that's really the concept behind NESEMC, is to bring about shorter path to greater deployment of solar by harmonizing various policy issues. In January 2015, the Department of Energy funded us and helped create NESEMC with our goal of increasing deployment in the Northeast states. We're focused on expanding best practices and new concepts for green banking, the valuation of solar, municipal permitting, and interconnection policy. These are near-term, immediate issues that deserve our immediate attention. And we've got success stories to share, and you can check on our website periodically to better understand our progress. One of the smartest things we've done as an organization is to recruit Dr. Richard Perez to our project, because while me and the people at PACE are busy focused on short-term issues, Richard is really several steps ahead. He's ahead of just about everybody, and you're really in for a treat. The information Richard's about to share is, I think, is really dynamic and insightful at the same time. I also think it's a call to action, because what might have seemed like long-range planning several years ago is pretty much staring us right in the face right now. So enjoy the presentation. Richard will take questions afterwards, and then look for an email from either Nick or me next week to set up a plan for putting Richard's conclusions into actions at the state level. With that, Richard, please begin.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Mike. And I would like to tell you about achieving very high penetration, which is the title of an article we just published in the Journal of Energy Policy, and with co-authorship from Carl Rabago, Mike Trahan, and Lyle Rawlings from the Coalition, as well as the team from Clean Power Research, Ben Norris, Tom Hoff, and Morgan Putnam, and also my son, Mark Perez, who back then was working for a company in France, but now has just joined the team at Clean Power Research. And much of what I'm going to present here, some of what I'm going to present here, stems from his PhD research. So the points I'm going to cover today are very high penetration, all the way up to 100% if we want to, is an affordable proposition if, and that's a big if, enabling solutions complementing PV generations are optimally deployed. And this will require an effective electricity remuneration system, more effective than the one we have today, and it will also imply the active participation of the people who operate the power grid, that is the utility companies and independent system operators. So I always start with this slide just to make the point that solar is a very large resource. It dwarfs all the finite resources, oil, gas, coal, uranium. It also dwarfs all the renewables together. It is much larger than the world energy consumption, which is 18 terawatts per year. Under every type of energy we use, from electricity to transportation to building, it's 18, and the solar is 23,000. And we're growing consumption, but it's still, by 2050, there'll be still plenty of sun to meet that demand. Now, this is one way to look at it, and we are touting shale gas and shale oil, but this doesn't change the big picture all that much. A little more natural gas and oil reserve. Solar is still the dominant resource for the long term. But the real way to look at it, and that's a new way, and maybe more effective way, is that big solar sphere of 23,000 terawatt per year is in fact only once every year, and every year you get one like that. So you get that infinite supply of very large amount of energy to compare to the finite resources. Plus, we know from climate change, from COP21 in Paris, that we have to leave at least 80% of the fossil reserves in the ground if we are to alleviate problems with climate. So this is the real comparison, in fact, when you compare solar to the traditional resource. And when you look at it this way, it's even more compelling. So we have a big solar solution, and that big solar solution we've seen is getting a lot cheaper. The price of modules has been decreased by, since I got started in the business, by over 200 times, 20,000%, and it will show no sign of going up. We're down, and we're going to stay down, and probably lower than that in terms of generating electricity with solar power. And it's very important to look at why that happened, especially the last 7 years of downward trend in price. It didn't happen as business as usual by itself, but it happened because something triggered it, and that something is Germany. If you look at installations per country, any times before 2012, this is what you would see. You'd see Germany leading the pack, Germany without much of a solar resource, leading the world by far, especially compared to the US and even to my state of New York back then. And what Germany did, they created a market big enough to enable producers like China to supply that market with lower priced technology, to the point where markets were created, price tumbled down, and now you have a world distribution that's more in line with economic realities, with the US slowly taking its place in the biggest markets. So that was 2014. In 2016, the US will probably be number 2, just behind China and the rest of the world. Now, we are not stopping there. That growth of PV will be in the thousands of gigawatts, maybe reaching terawatts by mid-century. So we're talking really high penetration here, even though we're not fully aware of it yet, but it's facing us. Now, that cheap and abundant solar has one big characteristic. It is also intermittent solar, and that's because this is what we get on any given day as far as resource in a northeastern state, so pretty much anywhere around the world. That power is variable. It's driven by the cycles of days, the seasons, and the clouds, and it's not your run-of-the-mill nuclear power plant. But this is what we need on the right. This is the load of, say, New England ISO or New York ISO. So how do we supply that need at high penetration with that variable resource? And this is an example of what happens when you put a lot of PV on the, for instance, here on the New York City grid. So that's the New York City load last summer, about 20 days worth of load with a night bottom and the daily peaks. And you see the New York City load is supplied by base load from nuclear and big hydropower plants on the Niagara River, and the rest is supplied by dispatchable generation, mostly natural gas. And when I put a little bit of PV on that load, it's very, very effective. It's the thing we know as peak shaving, high value, relieving stress on the grid, very well. But now look what happens if I put a lot of PV on that grid. If I saturate the grid with PV, then we see problems appearing. First, there is a big part of unmet load, and there is excess production that must be dealt with. So it's like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. Fortunately, there are solutions for that. So let's see what those solutions are. The first one that comes to mind is energy storage. So you take the excess and put it where you need it, in that unmet load portion. And storage technology is evolving really well. But there is a lot of work being done on batteries. The costs are coming down. The production is going up. especially if you couple that with electric transportation. There is a formula that could really work well. Then you have the big guns, the big storage technology like compressed air. Of course, you have hydrogen, which is elusive holy grail as far as I'm concerned. It's always 30 years in the future. And then you have the old reliable of gravity-based storage of pumped hydro, which currently in the world drives about over 96% of the electricity storage on utility scale. And gravity has a lot to offer. Here is a quick example of a technology I'm working with a French company called MGH, which is taking that gravity idea and exploiting it in deep oceans, where the potential of storage would be almost infinite. Another solution for high penetration is a synergy with the other, much smaller but still big renewable technology, which is wind, and that's because the production cycles on a daily basis tend to be in an opposition of phase. Wind tend to blow stronger in the evening and at night, and as well in a seasonal cycle, especially in the Northeast US, there tend to be more wind in the winter month than in summer month. So there is a good synergy complementarity here. Another solution is interconnection, and here I'm borrowing from my son's PhD. When you disperse production over a region, you solve much of the weather-induced variability. This is a solar availability for a city like New York, and it's 365 days of supply, and you can see it's all over the place. On cloudy days, it's way down. On sunny days, it's way up. And from a utility grid management standpoint, this is quite disconcerting to deal with. However, if you spread that resource regionally, and in that case, I spread it throughout the entire US, the weather variability all but disappears. You're left with tiny amount of variability, and all what's left is the seasonal variability, much easier to manage. Another solution is curtailment. This is considered to be a bad word, but I think as we evolve in the future, this will become the biggest enabler of high penetration. So this is how curtailment works. Here you have a single city, again, New York City, with its variable supply. But we remember that PV is getting cheaper and cheaper to the point where you will not need every single kilowatt hour that you can grab from that PV system to make your investment work. You may be able to get by with only the non-variable part. You can just spill over all the variable excess, and what you're left with in that case, and that's an example where I curtail 50% of the available energy from a PV system. I'm left with a very, very strong unvariable resource with only a few variability holes to fill in, much cleaner to manage. And finally, the last solution is load shaping, and that happens on the demand side. So here again is my high penetration problem with a big unmet load problem. And in load shaping, you entice customers to use power in sync with the sun, and that could be achieved, and I'll talk about it later, with appropriate tarification to achieve that. But when you do that, you increase the load when there is sunshine, but you also look at what happens to the red part. It's cut almost in half. So you solve half of the problem by reshaping the load and by having electricity customers, wherever they are on the grid, not only solar producers, to adjust their consumption pattern to better match the solar supply. So we have 5 enablers of high penetration. We have storage, we have synergy with wind, we have geographic dispersion, we have curtailment, and we have load shaping. And with all that, technically there is no problem to do 100%. The key question is, how much does it cost to do that? And these are the results of a study that considered it. It's an IEA study that was led, in fact, by my son Mark Perez for the IEA task number 8, that looked only at the pure solar solution, so storage, dispersion, load shaping, curtailment, ignoring wind. And the question that study asked was, how much does it cost to transform that variable solar resource into the equivalent of a nuclear power plant, something that supplied power 24/7 without any variability at all? And these are the answers. First, if you look at storage alone, your LCOE, the cost of producing a kilowatt hour from solar and supplying it as a equivalent of a nuclear generator, will be very, very expensive. It's going to be over $1 per kilowatt hour. So that tells me storage alone is probably not the solution, even though there is a lot of buzz talk about batteries. Even if they are very cheap, and here they took a very low-cost storage solution, there is still so much storage that will be needed to pass days and days of cloudy weather or seasons, that if you want to accomplish that, it will be too expensive. If you spread the resource, and here it's spread over a country, region the size of Texas about, then you take some advantage of the weather smoothing effect, and you can reduce the need for storage to the point where your LCOE is reduced substantially. It's still quite expensive at 70 cents per kilowatt hour, but the big gain happens here. And here I mix storage optimally with curtailment. So I overbuild my PV supply to the point that I can reduce storage enough. So there is a sweet spot between the two, playing with storage and curtailment, that really drags that LCOE way down to 28 cents. Still quite expensive, but better. 23 cents is the combination of geographic dispersion, storage, and curtailment. And that study was done with PV at $2.50 a watt. Now, if I take the sunshot objective of $1 a watt, I can get down to about 18 cents per kilowatt hour to supply the equivalent of nuclear power with PV. And if I add load shaping to that, and even paying for load shaping, that's another big enabler. I'm able to go below the 10 cents per kilowatt hour to supply the equivalent of nuclear power with PV 24/7. So that was done in the central US. There was a little bit more sun than in the Northeast, but in the Northeast the number would be 9 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour under these assumptions. So you can effectively replace something like Indian Point, north of New York, with PV and provide exactly the same reliability, even more reliability, because solar is much more reliable than nuclear. We all know that, at a cost of less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And in practice, if you do 100% penetration, it's going to be not as expensive, because the load you need to serve is not a flat base load, but it's a variable load, and that load tends to be somewhat sun-synchronous. So we have that big potential and that physically based reality, economic reality, and the question for us in the coalition, and us who are interested in making policies work, is how do we enable that potential? How do we make those solutions deployed optimally and go to 100%? And one of the key ingredients to that is has to do with the way we remunerate electricity, both on the supply and demand side, and try to think outside the box from what we've been doing now, both solar industry and utilities. And it comes from the fact that you have to realize that when you consider the grid with its transmission and distribution branches, and when you connect PV to that grid, it's driven by nothing else than the sun. And when those solar produced electrons hit the grid, regardless of the fact they'd be located on your side of the meter, on the utility side of the meter, regardless of the fact where you would promote self-consumption or not, this is a physical reality that when solar electrons are produced and they're connected to a power line, there is a physical effect that happens, and those electrons have a net value which depends on three fundamental factors. It depends on where you are on the grid. It depends on the penetration, how much the grid is locally saturated with PV. And it depends on the PV system specifications, how smart that PV system is relatively to the load. For instance, is the system facing in the right direction, mid-afternoon peak matching, or does that system have battery on board that can be dispatched, or is that system curtailable by the utility company or not? That will affect the net value. Now contrast those fundamentals with our current solar remuneration system. So currently, and that's for New York State, it may be different in other states. That's the example for New York. We have a 25% tax credit for residential systems. We have 30% federal tax credit, that's everybody. We have, if you're a business, you can take a 5-year maker, accelerated depreciation. In New York State, we still have a small rebate per kilowatt. And then there is net metering for the valuing the kilowatt hours. And when you contrast that remuneration system to the fundamentals, you see very, very little relationship between the two. We have a remuneration system which doesn't reflect the fundamentals at all. It's not a bad remuneration system for the solar community, and in fact, I'm taking full advantage of it with our new PV system. This is my house with my pre-net metering law PV system that was built in 1994, 2 kilowatts, very vintage. But I'm going to take full advantage of that tax and net metering opportunity for me to upgrade my system after 23 years to a much bigger system that will also hopefully power electric transportation. So for the solar side, it's a really good. It's not a bad deal. And I'm also going to add smartness to the system. We're going to have a battery backup, and it could be dispatchable by the utility company. However, I'm just doing that because of my personal interest. I know I'm not getting operational value from that yet unless things will change. But that's a system which could be driven by a utility if the utility elected to do so. So however good it is for the solar community today, that remuneration system is heading into roadblocks. We see that in Nevada, and utilities all over the country are trying to put roadblocks into it. And you can understand why, especially from the net metering point. So we need a new supply side system, and especially net metering is the thing which will have to go somehow, however we like it in the solar community for now. And to understand why net metering is not good for the solar community or for anybody that's interested in high penetration solar, and believe me, 5 years ago I was not thinking like that at all. I was all pushing for net metering full speed. But net metering is something that works at the margin. And take that analogy of that tree. The vine here is the PV with its net metering, and the tree is the grid. And net metering has a fundamental flow, and it assumes infinite storage from the grid. You take it for granted. you have a PV system. When you overproduce, it goes on the grid. When you need the power, you get it back from the grid. But it assumes that the grid is always there. However, if you grow that, and that works well at the margin, it works well at our level of penetration. But if we grow PV beyond a few percent, up to 10 and hopefully 100%, which we can do economically, then if NEM is allowed to grow to the extreme, that's what will happen. You'll have the equivalent of kudzu destroying the forest. And that cannot be good for any of us. So we need to think of something that is supply side oriented, and there's been a lot of talk about value of solar tariffs. And in New York, they are trying to design tariffs which are based on LMP. The LMP is a local marginal price for transmission, plus D, which is the distributed value of PV, plus, most importantly, an E, and that E stands for environmental externalities, stands for economic development, and for enabling high penetration. So that E is probably the most fundamental, the most important factor to deal with when we will design value of solar tariffication for us, because much of the value will be in that, and more importantly, it embeds the enabling high penetration factor, which is how we pay for the solutions like storage, curtailment, load shaping that will facilitate vast amount of PV on the grid. Now on the demand side, we need something equivalent. We need a load shaping tariff to transform the load into something which is more amenable to accept larger amount of PVs. And that tariff could also be developed from the same fundamental drivers, which is LMP, distributed energy value, and environment, economics, and high penetration factors that will facilitate it. And by having a system that actually decouples the supply and the demand, that has all kinds of advantages. Most importantly, it keeps the grid operators in the loop instead of being cut out in a net metering situation. If you put yourself in the position of the grid operator, it's a lost customer, it's lost business. It all happens. And that's why they're trying to enforce fixed tariffs and all that, because they know they have to maintain the grid. So it would be a lot cleaner to have something that values supply for what it is and that shapes demand to make supply work. And utilities, that's their business model. They will buy that power from you and they will sell it to you as a customer. And utilities are very important because they are the best position to do that cost reduction, to manage the solutions like storage, geographic dispersion, curtailment, and demand side management most effectively, because they are the ones with a bird's eye view of the entire system. So they will drive those battery systems. It will be much more efficacious to do it from a grid bird's eye view than everybody doing it from their little unitary systems. And with that approach, I think we can reach 100% affordably. For us, very important pragmatic next steps for the coalition and for the business interested in moving beyond the current status quo. That's not good for anybody. So the step one would be to decouple supply side and demand side, so PV generation and consumption. And initially, this could be very easily done. Initially, we could keep the net metering rate as a quantifier of that, meaning that PV generation would be worth the net metering rate and consumption would be worth that same net metering rate. That implies no market disruption. However, fundamentally, there is a big shift here. You decouple supply side and demand side, and you get ready to value exactly what that supply side number should be and what that consumption number should be to do effective load shaping. And with the appropriate E number in there, I can tell most of the audience that supply side value will be of the order, or at least close, or most likely higher than the current net metering rate based on all of what I've seen, especially the E value if and when the environmental factor is really incorporated into fossil fuel generation. So with those pragmatic next steps in mind, I invite you to think big and to remember that view of the solar supply. There is no way to avoid it. It will happen. So let's make it happen in a nice and efficient way. And don't think small. That's the view that from many in Washington, where I am now, and many other places. And most importantly, tell whomever that matters that PV is more than one of the DERs. It's more than a distributed energy resource. PV is really the resource that will take us long-term and to big places. So thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. As always, a fantastic presentation. So if there are questions out there, please, you can submit them through the chat box to the right. I also think I may be able to selectively unmute attendees if you want to ask your question verbally, and you can tell me you want to do that by raising your hand, by pressing, there should be a button on your control panel on the right that looks like a little hand with an arrow. If you select that, it'll raise your hand and I'll be able to unmute you. But we do have one question that came in during the presentation from Mark Sandine, and Mark asked, why would you want to convert solar into baseload? Nuclear power plants aren't flexible enough to meet our demand curves. Why not look at it? Why not look at what it would take to convert solar into something like peaking power plants?
Well, that was an extreme, most difficult thing to do. So that tells you if you can do it with a base load at 10 cents per kilowatt hour or less, you probably can do it for variable generation, like New York City load as a whole, for a fraction of that price. So that's why we did that exercise. It was not that we wanted to do so, but by the same token, you can tell the people that want to keep Indian Point that we can do it with solar and it's not going to cost all that much. So it was an extreme case. It's not that we wanted to do so. So New York City variable load will probably be met at 100% solar at 6-7 cents per kilowatt hour supply.
Great, thank you.
Hope that's a satisfactory answer.
And it looks like we have a hand raised by Fortunat. So Fortunat, I'm about to try to unmute you. Hopefully this works. All right, Fortunat, you should be able to speak and ask your question. So I think you may be muted yourself on your own end, if you are trying to speak. Cause
can you hear me now?
I can hear you well.
Yep.
Great. I actually have two questions. Thanks, Dr. Perez. This was really great. My two questions are, I guess, first, as long as the transmission and distribution utilities make their best money from building transmission infrastructure, how do we get them to agree to a test?
So I lost part of the question here.
Yeah, Fortunat, could you repeat the last part of your question? It looks
Well, I caught the beginning of it, which was that utilities make money by building transmission infrastructure, and reinforcing that structure is one of the legs of getting to 100% PV. So we're going to have a very healthy grid with a good structure on it. So, but it's not going to bankrupt any of us in the process. So the utilities, I think, will embrace, are the best friend of PV, to quote Tom Thompson, and they don't know it yet. So it's really part of their business. They will do business with us as long as everybody's on the same page. We cannot conceive 100% PV without a good infrastructure because of the way the weather works. There is always a cloud somewhere, and it's cheaper to get the PV through the infrastructure than overbuilding your storage. And storage is not 100% environmentally friendly. So there is an optimum solution, and it involves a little bit of everything, including infrastructure.
And it looks like Fortunat had signed off and signed back on, so I'm going to unmute you one more time, Fortunat, and see if you can ask your second question if you'd still like to. And it's showing me that you're still self-muted, so. It looks like he might still be trying to connect. So we have one more question that did come in through the chat box. The question is, how much land would be required for 100% solar?
100% electric in the US, and that's the one I can tell from the top of my head, would be 1/4 of the area occupied today by the hydropower lakes. So imagine that hydropower supplies 7% of US electricity, and if you cover the equivalent of 1/4 of that with PV, you supply 100% of US electricity. So it's a small amount by any stretch of the imagination. We don't need to disrupt landscape and forest and deserts to do it. There is tons of space available. Roofs could amount to maybe 30–40% of total. The rest would be all other infrastructures like parking lots, roadway size, exclusion zones, and the like.
Great. And Fortunat, you're still unmuted, so if you want to ask your second question, I saw it. Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm driving in a bad spot. My second question was, how do you answer critics who say that customers like simple electric bills and that unsophisticated customers, especially low-income residential customers, won't be able to respond to load-shaping tariffs on the demand side, and thus will end up paying more for electricity than everybody else?
That's a good question. So already by decoupling your supply and demand, you make things a lot more simple. And I'm going to talk about the supply side first. Low-income customers could take part in the supply through community solar. They just buy a share of solar somewhere, and they get their income from the supply side tariff, which has nothing to do with their own consumption. It's totally decoupled, and that could be the same for anyone. If you have a bad site or a low-value site, well, you own your PV generation anywhere else. And for me, there should not even be boundaries on that. For me, you could own a PV system in California if you wanted to. But maybe I'm stretching it a little too much to begin with. On the demand side, there will be load-shaping tariffs. That will be more difficult for low-income customers to take advantage of if they don't have the. But I'm sure that people will come up with enabling you to take advantage, services that will enable you to take advantage of all those load-shaping options that will be available to you. So initially the load shaping tariff may be reserved for the top-notch customers, but I think it will come down over time. And the good thing is that we're not going 100% solar tomorrow. It will take a few years, not too many. So that load shaping tariff will be able to reach lower and lower tier customers. And if we do things well, it's not going to cost more than today. That's the most important thing. The bottom line is that you can go 100% solar in New York City with given the load demand of a city like New York to 6-7 cents per kilowatt hour, 100% solar. So that tells me that should be, if you add a premium of 30% for everything else, or even 50%, your low-income customer would pay roughly what they pay now or less for electricity, although it would be 100% solar. So that's not a bad proposition to defend.
Great. So we have a question from, or a hand raised by Lyle Rawlings. Lyle, I'm about to unmute you, and you should be able to ask your question. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. That was Nick, right?
This is Nick, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Lyle.
Good morning. So I had a couple of questions that I thought of while you were talking, and another regarding something that you and I have already talked about quite a bit. So the first is, the question is on a technical issue. You mentioned that one of the three important things about integrating PV on the grid is the specifications of the PV system. And lately, I've started to get very impressed with the magnitude of the capability of inverters that are an installed base, let's say in New Jersey, where we have 1.7 gigawatts of PV distributed all over the state in more than 46,000 systems. Many of those inverters have the capability to deliver or absorb reactive power. Mm-hmm. And that capability can be deployed in something called volt-var control. Many folks on the call may be familiar with it. But it is volt-var control is a very powerful way to help control voltage on the local circuits. And this, of course, is a big issue that's preventing PV from being connected on many local circuits in New Jersey. The utility companies are considering them already, quote, full of PV because of the difficulty they present in controlling voltage on those local circuits. Volt-var control could solve that problem, and not only that, some PV inverters have the capability to do this at night when the PV isn't even running, so that this would be an asset for utility companies distributed all over their grid. But we currently don't have the capability to harvest those assets because there's no requirement for those for all inverters to have that capability and no connection to actually use it. Have you considered in your research what the magnitude of that potential capability would be, what effect that would have on control of the grid, and how we could harvest it?
Well, the last part of your question first, how we could harvest it, would be to get the utility on board. Then they'll be open to get a system going with us instead of closing their mind to more PV because they're not talking to us. So I think getting closer to the utilities and grid operators in that respect would at least open room to do something intelligent about that. In terms of value per kilowatt hour, I think it would be in a couple cents per kilowatt hour, the distributed value, and that would, part of that LNP plus D, it would enhance that D value by substantially if you gave utilities that new tool to manage voltage, especially in the evening, in winter when you have lots of pull on the grid, having that capability on board. Yep. For me, it's all a matter of getting utilities on board and working with them and make a better case for all of us.
Thanks, Richard. And I had a second question, and this is on the other side of the spectrum, going from technical to political. The internal politics of the PV industry, as you know, there's active opposition to value of solar tariffs. And, you know, all of the benefits that you just talked about are compelling, but we still have some pretty powerful forces within the solar industry that are actively opposing it. Do you have any ideas on how we get over that hump and start to get the industry towards consensus on trying out this new way of doing it?
This is highly political, so the current system is a good cash cow for many, so nobody, if I were taking advantage of it, I would not like to change it. The status quo is good, so they're trying to push it as far as they can, but you know that the wall that they're going to get into is not too far. You cannot get beyond 20% or more penetration with that system, because utilities are going to just refuse to interconnect, and they'll have a good case. They'll say, oh, you have to install tons of storage on board, the systems will cost a lot more. So for me, I try to address that by my pragmatic next steps, which are to decouple the PV generation and consumption, and initially keeping the net metering rate as a quantifier of both. So same rate for consumption and PV generation. So financially, there is no change of what's happening today. But fundamentally, there is a big change, which is all of a sudden you don't count the consumption and the production. You count them separately. You don't look at the net balance between the two. And then that buys you time to devise a very effective long-term pricing system.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We have one more question that's come into the text box. There's another political question from Haskell Werlins, and Haskell states, "We in Massachusetts have been warned not to ask for a value solar tariff so long as we have a hostile DPU regime that will skew the scope and the results of the study to keep the value of solar below net metering rates, which have already been cut by 40% for new project interconnections. And the question is, how careful should we be as to what we wish for may not be what we really want as a result?"
Yeah, you have to be extremely careful. I hope you can present that next pragmatic step, which is in effect keep net metering financially, but change net metering so you can take the next step and give you time to breathe and look at those tariffs, which may not be in the end 40% below the current one, but maybe higher than that. Great. So I'd say you have to be careful, but not doing anything and keep being careful for many years will get you against the wall. That's my feeling on it. That's what happened in Nevada. If you want to connect your system to any power grid, you may not be able to do it if PV passes a threshold. And I would take the example of Germany that was able to put huge amount of PV on the grid, and the reason why it worked out that way is that they already had decoupled consumption and production with, so that was, even though ratepayers ended up carrying some of the burden, they accepted it for on environmental ground, but also that the system was in place So the grid actually did the accounting of getting feed-in power on the grid and then selling it back to those customers some other way. So I think that's extremely important step to take, to realize that photovoltaics is a supply side system. It's not a demand side thing. It can be on a very low penetration at the margin, as we all thought it was when PV was less than 1%. But if we want to grow PV, we have to take that step.
Great, thank you, Dr. Perez. So we are reaching the end of the hour here, and I'm not seeing any more raised hands or questions in the box here. So I'll say thank you again, Dr. Perez. That was a great presentation, and for I think a number of folks joined after our beginning little introduction. So I'll just restate that the webinar today was brought on behalf of the Northeast Solar Energy Market Coalition, or NESEMC for short, and the coalition, in a nutshell, brings together solar energy business associations and other stakeholders in the Northeast to harmonize regional solar energy policy and advance the solar energy market. We're funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshot Initiative as a cooperative agreement through 2017 as part of the Solar Market Pathways program. And I encourage you to look up the Solar Market Pathways program. There's a number of other really neat and interesting projects going on around the country. And you can find out a lot more information about us at our website, nesemc.com. We should be able to post this webinar up there as a video, hopefully by early next week. So if there's any of your colleagues or anyone else who might want to see this who weren't able to attend, they would be able to do it that way. But once again, thank you for tuning into the webinar today. And Richard, if you have anything else to say, I think we can wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, you can also read the Journal of Energy Policy paper, and if you cannot access it through any link, you can send us an email and we'll send you a copy.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and enjoy your weekend.
Okay. Good weekend to all.